And now on to our roundtable for this week. We're joined by Colin Reed, as you saw a few moments ago, a downtown business owner in Plattsburgh, Clinton County legislator, and a professor with the Economics and Finance Department at SUNY Plattsburgh. And also with us is Jay Bryan, who recently retired as a business and economics columnist with the Montreal Gazette. Nice to have you both. Welcome.
Thank you.
Just as the election season begins to heat up here in the States this week with the first debate among the Republican presidential candidates, Canada's election season is also underway. Canadians will head to the polls in October. Stephen Harper hoping to get his government re-elected. He's been prime minister for nearly 10 years now.
Yeah, 2006.
How much of a challenge is he facing?
I think he's facing something of a challenge, but he doesn't seem to have opponents who are very quick off the mark. They knew that this election call was coming. They didn't know exactly when, but they knew that it was coming pretty soon. And they don't seem to have done very much to put Harper on the back foot, even though there are a number of ways in which he could be criticized. Among others, the election law itself, which he changed radically last year to favor his own party, so that more money and more partisanship will be active in the election, and get out the vote efforts, which had used to be a key responsibility of Canada's chief electoral officer, have been prohibited. He can't do any of that anymore. I mean, it's so blatant that you would have thought it'd be a pretty good political issue.
Not a surprise, the Conservative Party.
Exactly, they don't really have to get out their base, but I don't think the opposition did much with that. Maybe it's the Canadian electorate that I should be criticizing, that we're all just too phlegmatic. But you know, he's been in power for a long time, and he's running into a very serious economic slowdown now. It's not yet defined as a recession, but the Canadian economy, by the federal government's own measures, has been shrinking for 5 months in a row. Another month and everybody's going to be using the R word. It's not really a recession if you use the kind of criteria that the best economists use, because it really has to be serious to be a recession. You have to see unemployment shooting up and consumer spending falling off a cliff and stuff like that. None of that's happening. Unemployment is remaining about where it was. And it's actually a tiny bit lower than it was a year ago. But it's a lot higher than it is in the United States. It's about 1.5 points higher in Canada, which means about, in real terms, about 0.5 point. We measure it differently. And what's maybe worse is that the growth of employment seems to be slowing down a lot. We had a good month a couple months ago, but basically most months this year have not been very strong. And we don't look like we're going to see much strength going forward, because a key motor of the Canadian economy, the energy sector, largely tar sands out in Alberta, is obviously lurching into the lowest year possible, with oil prices down to half or less what they were a year or so ago. Nobody's investing in new projects, and nobody's expanding existing projects. Everybody's in wait and see mode, and that's not very good for the economy.
And that's the primary reason that the economy is suffering.
Yes, the other parts of the economy are not doing too badly. Manufacturing is doing okay, consumer spending is doing okay. Exports should be doing reasonably well outside of energy. Energy exports will be doing okay in terms of volume, but we won't be earning a whole lot of money from them, because oil's not worth much these days. But we export a lot of other things. We export aircraft, and we export a heck of a lot of automobiles and auto parts. And you would guess, with the Canadian dollar down to right now somewhere close to I think 75 cents today, was at another 11-year low. By the way, another club that for the opposition guys to beat Harper with. You'd think that he'd just be flat on his back, but in fact, he's doing fine. The NDP socialist in American parlance leader, Tom Mulcair, is in the lead. I think he's favored by maybe 35% or so of voters in an average of recent polls. Harper's doing okay. He's favored by about 32%, so he's not really in terrible condition. And it's really the Liberal leader, Justin Trudeau, who was a kind of a flavor of the day, for a while after he became leader, has been kind of slipping the last year or so, and people are beginning to wonder if he's just kind of a lightweight. He doesn't seem to have too much to say that really addresses the concerns of Canadians. And he's down around 25%. He could certainly make a strong comeback. He has plenty of time to do it between now and the middle of October, but he'll need to do it in a big way.
Famous name, of course, the son of former
Justin
Prime
Trudeau,
Minister.
that's right.
Pierre Trudeau.
With not quite the charisma of his father, and certainly doesn't think on his feet nearly as quickly as his father does, I think, is his main disadvantage. But a very young, vibrant, attractive candidate.
Very personable guy, but exactly, he doesn't electrify anybody.
And have there been some gaffes that he's made in recent months?
He has, yeah. I can't specify for you what they were, but yes, he's not real quick on his feet, as Colin said, when he has to think fast under pressure. So we'll see what happens during the debates. We're going to have some debates beginning, I think, Thursday of this week, as we're taping. It'll be very interesting to see how he does when he has to face the music.
So it'll be debate night in both Canada and the U.S. on Thursday night.
It will be.
As you mentioned, we're taping midweek. Interesting to see how that goes. After 10 years, though, a lot of political leaders run into that fatigue factor, and you have to wonder if that may be the case here.
Right, and you know, Jay used the term he, personalizing Canadian government. Very much it is a he. They don't have the same sort of balance of powers like you do in the States. So a prime minister of a majority party can really move an agenda on forward. But after 10 years, you start hitting diminishing marginal returns. You've accomplished a lot of what you wanted to do relatively early on. So the last half of the 10 years is really maintaining that agenda, which gets a little bit stale. So people look towards another voice. And Mulcair, I think, is actually sounding pretty moderate for a socialist candidate and is really starting to attract that middle ground. And he's solidly got the Liberal and the left vote as well.
Colin, your point about he is doubly important with a prime minister like Stephen Harper, as you know, because prime ministers, as you say, are always the strong leader of a unified government, because you can't be the prime minister without having a majority, or at least a workable majority in Parliament. But Harper, unlike any prime minister that certainly in my lifetime, micromanages everything. Everything goes through him. Nobody else is a major center of power. He did have a couple of other strong ministers, most notably Jim Flaherty, the finance minister, who sadly died last year. But Harper is going to be the center of all attention. And it's a good thing he's an economist, because he's going to have a lot to answer for with the present state of the Canadian economy.
And other than the economy, has he had any scandal or any other issues that may dog him this campaign? I
don't know about scandal. He's had, I mean, in my mind, he came in as kind of a breath of fresh air after a scandal-plagued Liberal administration that had been there for probably too long. And I thought he was a breath of fresh air. You know, a lot of people thought he was a little bit more to the right than they were comfortable with, but they just thought it was time for a change. And they were right. And he came in promising to clean up the government and be transparent. For a little while, he stuck to that. And then he just clamped down like crazy. He has about the least transparent government we've seen in Canada in decades. There is scandal. There's a serious scandal involving senators, especially one in particular, a media star named Mike Duffy, who had tens and tens of thousands of dollars in expenses that were inappropriate that he was charging to the government, and he tried to sort of wriggle out of that by having, or he didn't. The prime minister had a good friend and political ally hand the money over to Mr. Duffy so he could repay it. But you know, it's sort of like robbing a bank and then offering to give the money back. You know, it's very nice that you're offering to do that, but the offense was committed, and people understand that you're not really a person of the very highest integrity once that happens. And you know, Duffy was Mr. Harper's choice, and it was Mr. Harper's friend who tried to help Duffy wriggle out of it in a kind of a sneaky way.
And unlike the States, in Canada, you're in the Senate for life.
Yes, and Mr. Duffy is going to be in the public spotlight in the coming weeks, because he's on trial now for breach of trust. And I don't know how it's going to go, but it's going to be catnip for the political reporters and very, very uncomfortable for Mr. Harper.
The campaign is going to be 78 days. By American standards, that's nothing. That's a blink of the eye, because we're already looking ahead to 2016. But for Canada,
just long enough for Donald Trump to clear his throat.
That's really. For Canada, 78 days is that's a marathon campaign.
Yeah, it's double the normal length. It's I think it's, if not the longest in Canadian political history, one of two or three that have been that long in 100 years or so.
And so we're in midsummer, vacation, holiday time. Are voters at all paying attention to this?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think even if the voting date, even if it were a normal length campaign with the voting date, coming up in a month and a bit, they wouldn't be focusing quite as quickly as all that. It's August, for heaven's sake.
And you talked about Tom Mulcair and also Justin Trudeau. Any other familiar faces, other parties that may play a role in the election and may just pull away enough votes that they could tighten the race for the front runners?
I don't think so. The Green Party, Elizabeth May, and in Quebec, Mr. Duceppe and his Nationalist Party, and they will appeal to their own constituency, but Mr. Duceppe has been kind of just eviscerated by the NDP sweep in Quebec. Elizabeth May is a very committed and somewhat effective campaigner, but there's not an awful lot you can do with the Green Party in a country whose livelihood depends on digging up stuff out of the ground, a lot of it pretty dirty stuff, and then selling it to other people to burn and pump CO2 into the air. So she's got a tough row to hoe.
In this country, leading up with the Republican debate this week, Congress has adjourned for August for their summer break. Before they headed out of town, both the Senate and the House agreed to temporary highway bills, transportation bills that will carry spending through to the end of the year. Some are concerned that it may set up a potential showdown at the end of the year. There's going to be another debate over the debt ceiling and all of that, and they fear that there could be another government showdown like we saw in 2013 coming to a head at the end of the year. The transportation bill, again, only temporary bills to fund through the end of the year. The House and Senate had different versions. Clearly, for our region, for the manufacturers here, transportation manufacturers, Bombardier, Nova Bus, and many companies here in northern New York and obviously in Quebec as well, where their home bases are. This is a major issue.
Certainly is. There's not too many rural communities that watch transportation bills as closely as we would here for a number of different reasons. We sell subway cars and buses in New York City, but also in Chicago and San Francisco. Bombardier and Nova Bus, Prevost, more of a luxury line, have been doing well for employment in this region. So this is something that's pretty hotly watched. I suspect that good sense will prevail and we can get a multi-year transportation bill finally eked out, and I'm hopeful that it's going to have a strong urban transportation component to it. Although, when you see oil prices go down as they are, that seems to take a little bit of the pressure off the urban transportation issue as well. So and hopefully they'll go up a little bit higher in the fall. And
part of the problem is by only having short-term funding, municipalities and such can't plan long range for their transportation needs, and they can't say, Bombardier, Nova Bus, we need an order in 5 years for this many rail cars or this many buses.
Of course, even doing major highway repairs, the whole contracting process alone might take 4 or 5 months. You need to do a five-year planning, a whole series of revolving 5-year plans, revising maybe every couple of years to do that effectively. So it really is poor government, poor management.
And the Senate version tried to attach the Export-Import Bank to it, to try to reauthorize it. It ran out at the end of June, and the Senate many in the Senate were hopeful that they could revive it and reopen the bank. But in the end, their bill did not include that. So is that the final nail in the coffin for the Export-Import Bank?
I think there are some people who are holding out some hope for the Export-Import Bank. I mean, we're the only developed country really that has chosen not to play in that arena. Canada, for instance, will try to support and smooth over those international transactions. We're not talking about the small mom and pop necessarily trying to go a little bit global, but we figure out ways to do the guarantees for medium-sized and large companies as well that employ tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in each of our countries. This is a very important mechanism.
We've heard a number of manufacturers from the North Country come forward and attach a number of jobs to being able to work with the Export-Import Bank and how much it translates in overseas sales.
Right, and we shouldn't really think of it as a subsidy per se. It's simply a method to try to reduce some of the risk and transactions costs in what are admittedly very complex transactions when you're talking about shipping goods and services over borders where there are different laws and different customs and even different banking regulations on each side of these borders.
If it's a subsidy, it's the most bizarre subsidy I've ever seen in my life, because the bank makes money and contributes to the U.S. Treasury. How can you complain about something that makes money for the government and for taxpayers and helps support export jobs.
Right.
And you say subsidies are the critics, many Republicans call it corporate welfare.
They call it crony capitalism, and that would be true if only favored corporations were able to get help from the bank. I'm Canadian, I don't know how it works in any great detail, but if it's anything like its Canadian counterpart, that simply isn't true. In fact, it probably, if it's anything like the Canadian equivalent, probably helps to get a lot of medium-sized companies started in the export world because that's their expertise.
Mm-hmm. We heard from Congresswoman Elise Stefanik this week. She's taking a different position on this than many of her Republican colleagues, especially in the House. She says it is critical to many businesses in the North Country.
It is, and certainly the North Country really gets cross-border trade, so she's really coming up to speed and being well schooled in that important aspect.
Economic news this week, auto sales are in overdrive, especially with, I guess no surprise, with gas prices down. Pickup trucks and SUVs are going gangbusters. Priuses, not so much.
Well, I guess if you've got some employment growth and you've got record low interest rates and almost record low gas prices, it would be pretty surprising if you didn't have a nice shot in the arm for auto sales.
Mind you, these pickup truck sales, though, there are also very fuel efficient pickup trucks that have come to market this year. Dodge is making a pickup that'll get up to 29 miles per gallon. Ford is 26, 27 miles per gallon.
Ford has that aluminum one.
That's right.
Yeah,
so I think
when we talk SUVs, it seems the most popular are now the crossover SUVs that are a little bit smaller, but get the much better.
Well, essentially they're tall cars instead of trucks with passenger cabins on them. So they don't have the great big heavy steel frame that takes a lot of gallons of gas.
But as you
around.
mentioned, Ford F-150 now made of aluminum, and of course much as we've often talked here, of course that's being watched closely by aluminum makers like Alcoa in Messina. Right. They are keeping their fingers crossed that this may be the vehicle of the future. Minimum wage. Since we were last together, the advisory board has met in New York and recommended that the minimum wage be bumped up to $15 an hour for fast food workers in New York State. For restaurants that are part of franchises that have 30 or more restaurants, so some of the larger franchises would be affected by this. Goes into effect in 3 years in New York, 6 years in the rest of the state. So that's a very gradual increase. I think a lot of people, when they first heard $15 an hour, were maybe surprised by that, but this would seem to be phased in over a number of years.
It is, and of course some people take offense at the way it was done. It was done in a beyond legislative process. It's through the executive branch instead. It will have still effect on mom and pops and other smaller restaurants as well, because obviously the place to work would be these larger franchises with the higher salaries. So I think it will raise average wages in that sector up, and the various other relatively low skill sectors as well. We've talked on the show before. I don't think it's the most effective way of addressing the problem. Certainly we need to really do something about that traditional low-income working-class families just barely eking to get by. However, about 2/3 of the individuals at the minimum wage are members of households that are at 150% of the poverty level. We're talking about kids primarily from 16 to 24 years old. So I think the sentiment is good, but I think the public policy tool that we've chosen to address the working poor is relatively ineffective.
Is it a job killer, as critics say?
I think it may be. We see when we go to the fast food outlets now that they're becoming increasingly automated, robotized. You're being encouraged to place your order on your smartphone before you even go there and just come and pick up at Domino's Pizza and that sort of thing. I think when some of the more sophisticated retailers, like the franchises, find that they're paying $15 for labor, they'd rather cut back on labor and use a little bit more automation. So, and actually Seattle's put this in place a little bit earlier than the rest and is already having some growing pains. There's restaurants that are going out of business, are hiring less, and the strangest artifact of all this is that a lot of the people who are receiving that higher wage ask their employer to then work less because they don't want to get over the threshold where they're not eligible for other various social services like Obamacare and that sort of thing. So this has got an awful lot of unintended consequences, even though I certainly admit the sentiment is good.
The the Seattle example is a good one to contrast with New York, because New York has done something a little strange. It's applied this, admittedly very gradually over a whole number of years, but it's applied this to one portion of one industry only. And that makes maybe some sense to somebody in policymaking circles, but I don't understand it, and it doesn't seem fair either to workers or to business people. If you're running a fast food franchise that happens to have 31 outlets, bam, you're paying a lot more for labor than someone in a franchise that has 29 outlets. And of course, if you're running a retail store, then you're not affected by this kind of thing at all. It's going to have very strange effects on people's ability to, or willingness to work in different sectors of the economy, which is not desirable. On the other hand, I don't think that we need to be nearly as worried about the number of jobs to be killed as we're told by folks like the Restaurateurs Association, because the respectable economic studies that have been done on this in recent years suggest that there's a natural experiment you can do if you want to find out if a higher minimum wage kills jobs. Look at a state that raises the minimum wage, and then look at the state next door that hasn't raised the minimum wage, and see how differently job growth performs. Not much difference.
That's correct. I don't think it's going to have nearly substantial an effect as some people think. It will have some effect.
It'll have some. We've heard
it'll distort all kinds of stuff in the state of New York.
That's right. Yeah.
We have heard from one restaurant owner. The Watertown Daily Times had an article. The owner who owns several Arby's franchises across the North Country and in the Syracuse area is going to close his Arby's franchise at the mall in Messina, New York, citing a big factor, the increase in minimum wage and also Obamacare and healthcare costs. But he is closing his restaurant there, saying that those two have contributed quite a bit to his decision to shut down that restaurant. We've seen it in major cities across the country, this push, as you mentioned. It's been going on for a number of years. Similar push in Canada for, we know that the minimum wage up there now is $10.55 an hour, and just went up in May to $10.55 an hour. But has there been a push to raise?
No, but Tom Mulcair, the NDP socialist federal political leader in Canada, may very well choose to turn that into an issue. We don't have the same issue with income inequality in Canada that you have in the United States, but only because it's not as extreme. We certainly do have an issue with income inequality, but we don't have a large population of billionaires who, up to now at least, have been able to exercise such a powerful influence on the political system that they really make themselves stand out in people's minds. And there's such a tightly woven social safety net, even after 9 years of conservative government, that people who sort of don't do really well in life still do have a significant safety net. Most importantly, they know they will always be able to go to a hospital or get medical care because that's provided by the government. But yes, it could be an issue.
And you mentioned Tom Mulcair. In the U.S., the socialists running as a Democrat, Bernie Sanders, our senator,
independent.
Yeah, independent, now running on the Democratic ticket, seeking the Democratic nomination. He is calling for $15 an hour minimum wage, to have that be the set minimum wage for everyone. So that is one of his big political issues.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with that. I don't think it's a panacea for all of the economic ills of the country, but it sure has caught fire as just a symbol of what basically a really rock bottom decent living wage would be for somebody who has a family.
And that's an interesting point. You know, the poverty level is based on the cost of food. A working income is considered 3 times the average cost of food for a household. So if a lot of these minimum wage workers are working in agriculture, in the food sector, et cetera, their wages go up, the prices go up. As the prices go up, that poverty threshold goes up. So there's greater pressure to up the minimum wage still further. So it's a strange phenomenon, a strange dynamic we've got going with the way we administer the minimum wage versus the poverty level.
Yeah, which gets back to what you were saying earlier. There's going to be clearly a lot of moving parts in this, and a lot of people in agriculture and in the restaurant industry and in the food service industry in general who are going to be looking very hard at ways of making their workers more productive, which means they won't have to hire as many of them. So maybe a good bit of that increase in the cost of food won't get passed on, but if that's true, it means that the number of jobs in those areas might not grow as much.
This week, the president announced his Clean Power Plan. It sets new limits for carbon pollution from power plants. targeting primarily coal-fired power plants, where the majority of the power in this country comes from.
That's right, and natural gas just recently surpassed coal as the primary fuel for electric power plants, but up till now coal has, for maybe half a century or a century, been the primary energy source for electricity in this country. Coal is certainly a lot dirtier in many of the pollution elements than alternatives, but it's about probably 40 or 50% bigger emitter than oil, and oil is probably about 30% bigger emitter of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases than natural gas. So I think it does push us a little bit more in the direction of reducing greenhouse gases by moving from coal to oil or natural gas, or hopefully to more sustainables.
And seeing a lot of opposition, threatened lawsuits from as many as 20 states, energy companies. No surprise coming from the states where coal is a big part of the economy.
That's right, Wyoming, Montana, huge sectors of their economy.
Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
West Virginia, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a huge fight, but the economics of natural gas are so good that those benefits that Colin's talking about, basically it's about half as dirty as coal when it comes to carbon, and it's even less dirty when it comes to looking at the other elements of coal, the fly ash and the other pollutants that it emits into the air. So the economics seem to be pushing in the direction that Obama wants us to go in. I think a lot of people are probably with him in hoping that regulation pushes us in that direction a little faster, because public opinion does seem to be, according to the polls that I've been seeing, moving in the direction of believing that global warming is real, that it's a serious, serious issue, and that we can't just put it off indefinitely.
Still the same. The president didn't stand a hope of getting this passed through Congress, so this was by executive order. And when he leaves office, the new administration could change this.
And it's certainly going to be challenged in court, although I believe that the court did leave a little bit of indication in a similar ruling about a year or so ago that there's a crack in that door that may allow him to do it.
Part of the Roberts Court seems to have a very strong conservative bent, but also a very strong, or at least the Chief Justice himself, a very strong interest in maintaining an element of civic mindedness that will enable him to leave behind a legacy he can be proud of.
Mm-hmm.
And part of this plan by the president also encourages renewable energy, and we're seeing a bit of a spurt right now across the nation. It's becoming more affordable.
Certainly it is. Even Elon Musk, who we've talked about on the show before, he's now investing in battery and inverter technologies that allow you to charge up the batteries when the sun's out, when the wind's out, when it's relatively cheap to buy power from NYSEG, and then pump it all back into NYSEG when it's more expensive. That's a useful technology because, of course, wind and solar are subject to the vagaries of nature. Mm-hmm. You combine wind and solar, though, with something that can be modulated, like hydroelectric, can be turned on and off relatively easily, and you've got some good energy sources. But we've got a grid that really hasn't been designed for that. It's really designed for 24-hour-a-day coal, primarily. Yeah. So we really need a big infrastructure investment to make this happen, and we need literally hundreds of thousands of jobs for installers and that sort of thing to truly go solar. The costs have come down with regard to the materials and the technology, but the installation still is not very competitive yet. We're
seeing a real push, obviously, by the states. They're trying to meet goals, and so there's really quite a push for both wind and solar, primarily solar now. With that, though, goes some of the issues that can go with a spurt like that. In Vermont, a lot of complaints about where they're being sited, that there's such a rush to get these solar farms up that there's been not enough oversight, and a number of these farms are popping up in communities where all of a sudden neighbors now look out their windows and have thousands of solar panels.
Yeah, and I personally find them attractive, just like I find wind attractive. To me, it's the aesthetics of sustainability, but it certainly is becoming important. If you're a member of a homeowners association, it often violates the rules there as well. So there are some real impediments.
So many complaints. There's now a board in Vermont that's meeting and will advise the legislature on whether some of the siting rules need to be changed, because many people thought that they were ignoring concerns and complaints of the communities and and neighbors and moving ahead to get these projects up.
Vermont's kind of a special case because an absolutely gorgeous landscape is one of the most important economic assets that Vermont has. But I think that for most of us in most of North America, even though certainly the New York side of the border is also gorgeous and Quebec has its own beautiful areas, I don't think we're nearly as sensitive to seeing a windmill on the horizon or a solar farm someplace, and certainly not seeing. It's not upsetting to me to see solar panels on my neighbor's roof or on a commercial building, and the cost of solar is going in the same direction as the cost of gas has gone, natural gas has gone. It's come down by what, about half or something like that? Just making the panel. That's not the total cost, but it's a very big part of it in the last number of years. So
it's still
there's
highly
room for optimism.
subsidized too. If you take into account the federal and the state subsidies, tax credits, and then the depreciation allowance, about 80–85% of the cost of that solar installation will be covered, offset, which is very, very substantial.
Just a few years ago, it was just people would look at the investment and it would just seem a little too long, 15, 20 years or more. That's changing now where they look at the payoff coming much sooner?
Just the materials costs have probably come down by a factor of 75% in the last 4 or 5 years. The installation hasn't changed all that much, and that is still a big bulk of it. But it has really come down. If we can get a more of a modular form, more installers, more competitive industry, certainly can easily compete with other forms, more traditional forms of energy.
And before we go, we want to talk about a potential rivalry that may be renewed north of the border. The Montreal Canadiens may have rivals in Quebec City for the 2017-2018 season, and for a lot of folks this is a big deal. They've felt a real void since the Quebec Nordiques moved to Colorado back in 1995 and became the Avalanche. And
there's a hole in the heart of a lot of hockey fans in the Quebec City region, and maybe even in the Montreal area, just because it's nice to have a rival down the road who's kind of a friendly rival.
It's not cheap becoming an NHL franchise now, and
nope.
Quebec City and Las Vegas are the two cities that it looks like will get the winning bids. But it's $500 million to join the NHL.
Just look at the difference between Quebec City and Vegas, and you can sort of scratch your head about Quebec City. Quebec City is a hockey crazy town, absolutely no doubt about that. Just about any city in Canada would be. But Las Vegas is several times the size of Quebec City, and if you look at the number of hundreds of thousands of visitors that they have in a month on top of that, it's kind of an obvious place for a new pro sports franchise. Quebec City, well, it didn't do too well last time, and one of the things that killed it was the low Canadian dollar. Well, where's the Canadian dollar now? Well, it's very, very low. One of the big things that it has going for it is that the Quebec government is just as big a sucker when it's asked to subsidize something that's popular as it ever has been. It'll subsidize anything that sounds like it's an auto plant, an aircraft plant, or a pro sports stadium, it seems.
Especially if it's hockey.
So they bought this, they built this stadium, this arena in Quebec City. It's a $400 million arena, and apparently quite a nice one. A very intimate arena where the sightline, it's very steep, the seating, so the sightlines are great. Everybody is very close to the ice, and the fans will probably keep it 95% full, which is great. Problem is that not much of the benefit is going to move on to the government, because the rent has been fixed at a very, very low $3 million or so. And if Mr. Pellado, the owner, the biggest media magnate in Quebec, is successful in getting his NHL team, then the rent will go up to maybe $5 million a year, which I think doesn't even come close to covering the nut on a $400 million mortgage and paying it off. Yeah. But the hockey fans will be very happy.
But as you mentioned, the owners have deep pockets.
They do, yes. They don't, and they're not having to dip very deeply into their pockets because the arena's already been built. They are going to have to dip pretty deeply just to buy the right to have an NHL team, though. That's another, $500 million or so from what we hear. So,
but that's an asset value because
it is. That's right. It's not money. It's not money that's being spent on something that's good for basically one purpose only, and that will have to start being maintained or rebuilt after 20 years. It's there, and it's going to increase in value. Pro sports team owners sometimes complain about the fact that they're not making any money, but strangely enough, when they wind up selling the team, they wind up selling it for 2 or 3 or 4 times as much as they bought it for. It's a big benefit to be the owner and not to be the public body that's building the arena.
And it is a different world now than it was 20 years ago when the Nordiques left. Obviously, television is much more prevalent. More games are available on cable networks and such, and so that has changed as well.
Yeah, I don't know how the economics work out for a place like Quebec City, which is not a massive media market because it's just not a big city, and it's not surrounded by big cities. So I don't really know how that works out in terms of what the value of the TV rights will be. The value of owning that team to Mr. Pierre-Carl Pelado, who's the leader of one of Quebec's political parties, the separatist one, the Parti Québécois, is probably pretty substantial. I don't know how that works out, but it sounds like it's like a kind of a win-win-win for him.
Well, we began on politics. We'll leave it on that note on politics. And Jay and Colin, thanks a lot for being with us.